second. All right, so we are recording. Nick, please take it away.
Okay, thanks everyone for having me. And before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the Dajawang people of the Jara Nation in central Victoria, on whose lands and waters I come to you today, and to pay my respects to their ancestors and elders, past and present. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations people who may be present live today in the audience, but also those who might tune in later on through the YouTube channel. I had intended to talk about Richard Routley Sylvan, and indeed the archival research that I did as the, what do they call it, the Friar Library Fellow of 2020, where I went through all 184 boxes of the Richard Sylvan collection that you see in the slide here. And I am going to do that, but I thought, not knowing my audience, it might be a bit dry and drab and boring. So I will open the door to a more fruitful and detailed conversation about the ins and outs of the archive and what I found and how I found it. And I'll also, in so doing, share some tips, I guess, for those who would like to encounter the archive. And I understand that many of you are interested in different subfields of philosophy, particularly logic, environmental philosophy, and other areas, not specifically nuclear philosophy, which is one of my primary interests. As has been mentioned, and I'll get to this later on, my background's more in international ethics, international philosophy, and there's always that tension between philosophy and politics, and I sort of straddle that tension. And specifically, I'm interested in environmental issues, particularly environmental ethical issues. So the moral status of the non-human. In my time at UQ as a PhD student, I came into contact with Dominic Hyde and Roger Lamb. Dominic, I know is here on the line. And both were very helpful, and I'd like to acknowledge that help back in, what was it, probably 2014, 15, that sort of area. We would get, or Dominic would get several iced coffees and would have a cup of tea and a chat about Sylvan. And I know, as I understand, that Dominic and Roger are still working on a compendium of environmental philosophy of Richard Routley Sylvan. So what I went into the archive trying to find was insights as to Richard's nuclear philosophy, and that is his nuclear ethics, both weapons related or militaristic, and also civilian, energy related, as well as where they straddle and where they meet, and that is through the production of waste. But in so doing, I found very little actually in scanning all of these boxes that you see in front of you. I found very little because of the unorderly nature of the archive. Is very difficult to penetrate. The way in which it was archived many years ago by Nick Griffin was hurried, and he had to speed up his process after spending the first couple of weeks of his month-long stay. But nevertheless, all of his good work has not been, I guess, re-archived by the institution, by the University of Queensland. And there are many reasons for that I'm campaigning to remedy. That is to say that if one encounters, say, a letter by Richard Sylvan Routley that you were interested in, whether it be a terse email to administrators at the Australian National University or a response to peer review, it's usual that you can look within a folder or a box or a series of boxes related to correspondences, and you'll be able to find the corresponding letter by circling out, rippling out from that point. That is not possible in this collection. Material is absolutely everywhere, and you find letters strewn in any one of these 184 boxes. So if you want to find what happened next in that drama, whether it be a professional or academic one in Sylvan's life, it is very difficult. And so I'd like to state that from the outset. Now, instead of going through in too much detail, as I said, Richard Sylvan's nuclear philosophy and how I encountered the archive, I wanted to first just outline a book that I'm working on that's driven a large part by Sylvan. And so I have a little vignette to read about that, and it pertains particularly to the weaponization of nuclear weapons, but nevertheless, the book extends outwards to deal with the civilian aspects as well. So the book, the vignette. The world's first nuclear weapon detonation occurred in Amontillado in New Mexico on July 15, 1945. Within 23 days, these very nuclear processes were inflicted upon the cities and peoples of Hiroshima. That same afternoon, the New York Times quoted President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, as declaring that unless the Japanese surrender, its peoples might expect a reign of ruin from the air like the like of which has never been seen on this earth. 3 days later, another more powerful American nuclear weapon was detonated over the city of Nagasaki. Then, as now, philosophers and strategists tend to agree that nuclear harms such as this are not merely different in degree, but fundamentally different in kind from all others that have been deployed before it. Different in kind, both technically and strategically, but also morally and politically. To illustrate this, let us consider the scientific effect of nuclear weapons that marks them out as distinct from other explosive devices, that is radiation. The radiation that results from nuclear weapons detonations, whether in warfare or peacetime, follows two distinct pathways. External radiation from direct exposure to gamma rays, that is if you're caught up in the blast zone of the device. And secondly, internal radiation from indirect exposure, that is radioactive particulates, things that you might consume through water or through air. So that's beta and alpha emitters. Whilst the pathways of radiation and its effects certainly marks nuclear weapons out as distinctive, their pathways are most commonly conceived in strictly human-centered terms. What matters for these same philosophers and strategists that I'm alluding to, as well as President Truman, is human pain, suffering, and vulnerability, not what might loosely be termed ecological ones, unless they rebound, of course, onto the human and thereby obtain some human interest. Humans are, in this rubric, what Val Plumwood would later term hyper-separated from nature, despite the indiscriminate pathway of radioactivity. No more is this expression more clearly found than in what I call the anthropocentrism of nuclear extinction arguments. And I'm going to read a couple of quotes here from very prominent realists, political realists, philosophical realists, that will hopefully drive this point home. Several decades before planet Earth was scientifically accepted as operating as a single self-regulating system with interlinked processes and subsystems, a select yet diverse group of scholars began positing that nuclear weapons had an intrinsically cosmopolitan character that will challenge the security and survival of all humanity equally. For instance, in 1959, John Herz was one of the first to say that nuclear weapons presented an unprecedented condition that has befallen mankind, pardon the gendered language. Before going on to add that, the first thing to realize is that the situation confronts, for the first time, the whole human race as one group. Similarly, Hans Morgenthau, another quite famous political theorist in international studies and elsewhere, concluded that nuclear destruction destroys the meaning of death by depriving it of its individuality and the meaning of immorality by making both society and history impossible. Taking this problematization of the very meaning of life and death further, quite a different scholar, although connected in many ways, Hannah Arendt says that nuclear annihilation becomes the most potent symbol, in her words, of the unity of mankind, in eliciting a negative solidarity based on her realization that, and I quote, the remote possibility that atomic weapons used by one country, according to the political wisdom of a few, might ultimately come to be the end of all human life on Earth. This is just an example of some of the literature here from realists and others. Suffice to say, nuclear harms do more than just target the human, I want to argue. They violate what was once whole. Working in this vein, my manuscript and companion web archive, that's the subject of the Frye Library Fellowship and took me into this Richard Sylvan collection, titled Antipode and Anti-Nuclearism, imparts itself onto this terrain by confronting the liberal notions of harm and cosmopolitanism with nuclear pain, suffering, and vulnerability at post-human spatial and temporal scales. In sum, nuclear harms transcend the human body, as I stated earlier, thereby reconfiguring the relationship of humans to the social categories of space and time. For example, let me just flick through. The militaristic applications of nuclear technology via the deployment of nuclear weapons has the capacity to consign Earth as an unsafe operating space for all life, not just exclusively human ones. Universally, the civilian application of nuclear technology via nuclear power plants, for instance, routinely produces waste that must be isolated from people and their environments for up to 100,000 years, and even, I should say, 1 million years, depending on how the uranium's enriched. In this way, the problem of nuclear harm is acknowledged as future cultural and environmental heritage, and this is the subject of my work now at Deakin. Timothy Morton gestures towards the importance of nuclear harms in developing his notion of the hyperobject, for instance, to denote that a thing that is so massively distributed in space and time that we can't point to it so easily. In fact, he was so enamored, Timothy Morton, with nuclear harms that he wanted it to be the image of his book about the hyperobject, but instead couldn't really visualize it, and at least his publishers couldn't. And so they instead opted for, I believe, an iceberg, which is a familiar trope, of course. Thus, the neat divisions that have been erected in Western thought between past, presents, and futures collapse down into a swamp of time. More recently, in a relatively little-known essay on radiation as hyperobject, Morton makes plain any inferences from his earlier writings by stating that in an amazing paradox, nuclear radiation, despite all its physical violence, teaches us how to think less violently than what too often passes for environmentalist thought. Simply put, nuclear harms stage an encounter between humanity and ecology that I posit cannot be ignored by even the most ardent human chauvinists, to borrow a phrase from Plumwood and Sylvan. Yet distinctly unlike Morton and others who deploy a nuclear imaginary but resist staying with the trouble, as Donna Haraway might put it, I argue that doing so requires nothing less than reimagining the conceptual, empirical, and normative characteristics of harm in the nuclear age, but also our understanding of the subsequent efforts to variously prohibit them. Empirically, it involves reimagining the problem of nuclear harm so as to encompass not only the harm that is inflicted on human beings, but also those that violate non-human beings and things. Conceptually, it awakens us to the fundamental fact that nuclear harms reaffirm the co-constitution and mutual implication of human life with Earth's biosphere. Further, that nuclear harms occur on greater than human spatio-temporal scales cast doubt on the continued distinction between the human and non-human worlds. Normatively, it prompts us to take seriously the need for a new multi-centered nuclear ethical theory that neither, and this is borrowing from Plumwood, decenters the human nor relegates it to the periphery, but rather resituates nuclear harms in to humans in ecological terms and the ecological dimension of nuclear harm in ethical terms. More concretely, the manuscript that I'm working on from this Richard Sylvan work reconstructs ultimately the non-anthropocentric nuclear ethics and non-status nuclear politics of Sylvan as the pioneering environmental philosopher, based on several years of archival research. Now, I say reconstructs in parentheses over the re because much of what Sylvan wrote about nuclear weapons, nuclear winter, and nuclear war was indeed vehemently anti-nuclear, vehemently opposed to nuclear weaponization, vehemently opposed to nuclear deterrence, and indeed the possibility of proliferation. He didn't yet make the connection really between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy through nuclear waste. You know, both sets of processes, whilst to different ends, and having different moral arguments for and against them, do universally produce nuclear waste. But nevertheless, he was vehemently anti-nuclear. The interesting thing, though, about that anti-nuclearism that was particularly evident in the 1980s through around 2 or 3 published papers, and one in critical philosophy and another in a book chapter, and then 2 self-published working papers, was that he sort of set aside his non-anthropocentric commitments and instead followed what you would call a human-centered argument. And he did so very pragmatically in order to win the moral argument. He felt it was insufficient. It was not insufficient. It was not useful to deploy and to go to pains to argue non-anthropocentric arguments against nuclear war. It was just so plainly, blatantly obvious on the human-centered grounds. So there's a philosophical inconsistency between Routley's writings that, whilst fully acknowledged, is for me, in my reading, and maybe Dominic and others can comment further, is quite uncharacteristic of Richard. He never seemed to me to take an easy way out of an argument. And yet in this, on this score, for something that he wrote relatively little about and was fundamentally not very well known for, he decided to trot out very familiar arguments that ultimately weren't that interesting. They're not that novel. They're not new. There are many decades of people making similar arguments, albeit through different means. So I'm working through this book, and this is the reason why I sort of have come to Richard Sylvan, Richard Routley. Dating back to around 2012 is when I started to think about Richard Sylvan, and I encountered, like many people, I think, the last man example, that being the argument that he produced and delivered in New Zealand and Bulgaria and other places from 1971, 1973 in particular with the World Congress. That argument really enamored me, to posit that you're the last person on earth and to think through the moral dilemmas of harming the non-human, and to confront the reader with their human-centeredness, and that their intuition that the last person was acting morally wrong, but yet there were no tools, no tools in a lot of Western thought to follow that argument, to follow that intuition. I thought was very profound. And when I read more about it, I came across the usual figures in environmental philosophy, Holmes Rolston III, J. Bed Collicott, Robert Attfield, and others, including Dominic. And what struck me about the retellings of the story of the last man example was that a nuclear imaginary was front and center of that imaginary. Perhaps because these retellings were found in the mid 1970s and particularly the early 1980s when these three individuals became much more well known and well published and were much more experienced at publishing and writing. But ultimately, I found that quite interesting that a nuclear imaginary had been imported into Sylvan's last man example, because he makes no comment of that. He does mention radiation in a further description of the last people example, but he doesn't, quite clearly, he doesn't state the methods or means of harm that the last man in his example is dishing out. And that really struck me. So I stuck with that for a time, and that's how I came to encounter Richard Sylvan. And I've just lost my screen, hang on. So you're still seeing, I hope, the slides, is that right? Yeah. So I've already said a little bit about me, but essentially I'm at Deakin and I'm now looking at Australian nuclear fuel cycle as future cultural and environmental heritage, but I'm still finishing up this book based on my PhD and the Fryer Library Fellowship on Richard Sylvan. I've worked, because many of you won't know anything about me and maybe don't need to, but nevertheless, I do work on nuclear issues and I have worked on them for about 20 years. And that's significant, I think, to share, because I've deployed many different ways of encountering the nuclear. Principally, originally, it was through my role as an investment ethicist. Now, don't hold it against me, but I was recognized by UniSuper as the pioneering researcher looking at fiduciary duty and rethinking fiduciary duty to include I guess the environmental impact of pension funds and super funds, and indeed the investment industry in general. Given the scale of the Australian investment industry, that was quite a high pressure job. And when my father died, which I've published about, I quit in the late 2000s and I began this work into Richard Sylvan. But nevertheless, I've employed many different ways of looking through the nuclear issue. Many of them have become archival. So I've looked into Indigenous artworks over time, and indeed settler artworks in Australia for a Maralinga project. I've looked at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and many other different areas of this particular problem. So this is, I guess, how I've come to Richard Sylvan. Many of the topics that I've looked at have had some, I guess you'd call them cross-cutting sort of concepts that have linked them together. You see there in grey, the harm project. Am I still connected? Yeah, I've just got a message. The harm principle itself, liberal harm principle, as a seed of both a human ethic in many people's mind, particularly cosmopolitans working in global ethics like Andrew Linklater and a few others, but also the charge that it was a seed of anthropocentrism from people like Sylvan. So this is my encounter with Sylvan. It's from a former life as a business ethicist, as an investment ethicist, as an applied professional ethicist, working for about 10 years in that space, and then drifting back into academia and encountering Sylvan. And for some reason, I became quite enamored with Sylvan, both as a person, despite, as I understand it from reading people like Dominic's biography, that the difficulties that a friendship or a relationship with Sylvan may have presented, I sort of became quite enamored with his work in environmental philosophy. And when I found that there was this nuclear imaginary imported into his nuclear to his Last Man example, and that I found rather that he had also produced a small number of works that he published on the nuclear issues, I was really intrigued. And then when I discovered that he, and partly through Dom and others and Roger, that he had self-published a lot of his material after the Fight for the Forests affair and various other things going on in his life, it intrigued me even more. And so I started to collect this material, particularly through Dom and others. And then when I discovered that there was this 184 box sort of archive at the University of Queensland, I was very intrigued, but I was sadly disappointed, as I said in the outset, that it was organized in a way that was almost impenetrable. I had no experience of that sort of archival research. I'd only ever done it into memory institutions, museums, these places that are very formulaic and adopt conventions that I could bore you with. And that's not at play here. This is really a geographical archive split between the three offices or home offices that Richard had. The ANU was his office, but many people say, and I've heard many stories recently, including from Dom and others, that it was just a place that he stored papers. It wasn't his office, but instead his two homes were his office. And so the archive is split between in this way, this geographical way, principally, but also there's an attempt to conceptually order it. But there's no attempt to order it by the type of manuscript, again, to put together all of the correspondences. One might see an amazing piece of correspondence. It's very intriguing, but for the nuclear issue, or maybe for some things that others that I know are working on. But I can never find how that played out, because the archive is ordered in the way that it is. So ultimately, this is how I came through The Last Man, how I came to encounter Sylvan. Just flick through here. And in so doing, I sort of became a bit forlorn. I had the pandemic to deal with during the Fryer Library Fellowship. So it wasn't until, because I'm from Victoria, it wasn't until the first visit. And so I basically worked with my daughter in Airbnb with my partner. I basically worked 20 hours a day. I slept for 3 hours a day, and I worked for 14 days or 17 days actually, because I didn't have much time with the money and with the COVID and all this sort of thing. But in so doing, I found some really interesting things that I'll share, both processually and also in terms of documents. And this is one I've shared with Dom before, but randomly in something like box 76, I found these 2 pages, handwritten notes that are, as you can see on the left, noted E-Ethics, Part 1, Ethics. What I take from this is that it's an attempt at formulating a table of contents for a manuscript, compiling and also extending Richard's environmental ethics. So actually playing out and building the non-anthropocentric new ethic that he had called for in 1973 and earlier and subsequently. Never before has that sort of material been combined. And again, Dominic and Roger, I know, are working on such a feat. But this was really interesting and obviously interesting to someone like Dom, so I shared it. But there's many items like this that are very hard to kind of identify and point to unless someone asks me. And no doubt there are others that have spent some time in the archive as well. At the same time, it's most of the archive is like this. Richard's known to have very impenetrable, unreadable handwriting. Much of it is handwritten before it's typeset by one of his typists. But this is one of the lucky examples of 2 draft manuscripts, of which the one on the left, I found about 15 different versions of this manuscript with different titles, removing, you see, ethical, social, and political. Often it's just ethical and social. Sometimes it's ethical and political, removing the social. And it's very hard to understand how the manuscript has changed. What we can do through proper digitization is extract through the PDF the text, so the text becomes readable. And I'll try to share the screen with you now. Let me see how I might do this. Sorry. I might show you the archive. So a lot of the materials that I identified, and there were hundreds, to the chagrin, I'm no doubt, of the Fry Library and all the people that are involved. You know, there are 20 people literally that helped scan these documents through the pandemic, and I'm endlessly grateful. And for it, a couple of weeks ago, I sent them, you know, a couple of $100 of chocolate, so as a thank you. Thankfully, it got there before the floods. But essentially, there's so many people involved in this, and they are acknowledged in this portal. Can you see the website now, like with a picture of? Hoping you can.
We've got
yes,
the papers.
yes. Yep.
Yep. So essentially what I've done is I've uploaded all the items to this portal. So you can see browse items, 144 total. And each item is titled by the library under their conventions and is flatbed scanned at very high res. But when there is, and that's a bad example, I probably should have had one at the ready, maybe this one. When there is text that can be extracted, you'll see that there is very ugly because it reformats. It's a problem I'm working through. It exports the text from this PDF. So depending on your knowledge of PDFs, when they became readable through different scanning technologies, you can extract that text. You can search Control F a PDF. This essentially does the same thing, extracts the text, reformats it in this very ugly way. This is not how it's formatted in the actual text, but nevertheless, it has all the words there, and one can perform some form of textual analysis to have a look at the different versions and different edits that Routley made. And this is the work that's ahead of me. It's been a massive project, partly because of the scale of the archive, as you can see from this image. But also how it's organized and how it needs to be organized. And that's not just me being critical, that's the library conceding that if the collection's to stay as it is, much of it might need to be culled because some of it is literally just books, not much of it, but some of it's just copies of books that are readily available. It needs to be curated in a more useful way for an archival researcher or anyone to encounter. What I've done to help those who are potentially interested in looking at the archive for their own reasons, and I know I'm sort of meandering here, but I'm doing it so I get a whole range of different comments and insights from you. I've made available what I call my manuscript finding aid. Now, the library and Nick Griffin have their own one. It's about 150 pages or something, and it goes like this. It's hieroglyphics. You know, there's box numbers, there's item numbers, there's folder numbers. And what you'll find is that the folders and the items are not in the box that they say they're in. The level of detail, obviously, given the task at hand, is quite minimal. And as I said, there are correspondences strewn throughout all of these different things. So what I did is I started to collate the different boxes, the tag that was assigned to the box, and my box notes versus the notes that were given by Nick Griffin and indeed the library when a small number of changes were made. And a number of additional items were added by a scholar who was working with Sylvan at the time of his death. All of this goes through what I got scanned and what I didn't and why. You'll see that some material is now open access, meaning it is on this archive, Antipodean Anti-Nuclearism. It's also on the Fry Library eSpace website, which is a bit messy to navigate, but nevertheless, it's there for perpetuity. I'm happy to talk to anyone about the processes with which I went through this and what I found and what I saw, you know, photos of Sylvan that I know are quite rare, postcards that he sent to his family, sketches for a different camera, sort of rangefinder camera that intrigued me as a photographer, all sorts of different weird and wonderful things. But that's all I really wanted to speak about today. And I was hoping in future, because I'm just about to submit this manuscript and companion website to my publisher, that I might come back in a year or so and talk about maybe some more of the ideas behind Sylvan and his nuclear thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I should also say, I can also, it's here, but I glossed over it, so it's a bit messy. I've also got 3 papers that I could distribute. You know, if anyone's wanting to read some draft chapters, these are papers, chapters that I've got for my manuscript, and indeed the proposal itself that my publisher's seen a couple of years ago. You know, I'm happy to share this stuff. Each of them about 30, 40 pages. And one of them goes through Richard's overview of his Antipodean nuclear philosophy that I've only obviously really just touched on, both the political element, the ethical element, and the ethical element being quite nuanced because of, again, the anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric threads to that work. but also quite a detailed study of the last man example itself and the nuclear imaginary that I say was imported into it by Collicott and Ralston, and thinking through the implications of that changing of the argument. So I'm happy to share those with anyone. Thanks.
All right, let's thank Nico for a very interesting presentation, guys. Thank you, Nico. And now I'm gonna stop recording.